Hi, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. I'm going to give people a couple minutes to hop on. I'm starting a little early tonight, but tonight we're going to be talking about cadence. So that's primarily for my runners out there, but this can definitely apply to anybody else who's out there who does any sort of running for their fitness or for their sport. If they do it as conditioning, just something to keep in mind. Biggest thing when it comes to cadence is that people tend to have this magic number. Well, first of all, what is cadence? So cadence is how many steps per minute you're taking. So there's this magic number that people like to throw around and say the perfect cadence is 180, and that's simply not true. Everybody's body is built differently. We have different proportions, and so we're all going to have a little bit different cadence that's going to be optimal for us. Now, that being said, we do have low ranges and high ranges we like to be in. Say generally, I want my runners to be somewhere between 160 and 190. If we're outside of that range, then I kind of say, probably need to make a little change here. Now, once they're within that range, depending on what I see when they're running or any complaints that they're having, I may or may not change it. Again, there's no magic number. It's just somewhere in that range is where you're going to be. And we need to find where you're going to feel best and be most efficient there. So when someone does need to change their cadence, what we typically do is set a metronome and bump it up. First, use our calculator, and so whatever cadence they're naturally running at, we multiply that times 1.05, and that's a 5% increase. And so we start small, set the metronome to that number, and then have you run at that pace for a little while, and then as that becomes more comfortable, turn off the metronome and just kind of run for a little while. That would get very annoying to have that metronome going the entire time, so it's just not practical. But check in throughout your run and see, okay, where am I at? Did I keep it? What does that look like? So when we choose to change cadence, there can be a couple indications. It can be usually if we're in those parameters, my indication to change your cadence is pain or history of pain. Or I start seeing some gait inefficiencies that I think could be improved. And so we can use that that cadence to help as a cue for you to think about. And those inefficiencies sometimes will read themselves out there. So one of the common ones that I'll use cadence for is overstriding. So when I see people landing with their foot way out in front of them, sometimes increasing their cadence and having them run to that metronome can be a really helpful cue for them. Now, a lot of people work in different ways and their brain works a little bit differently, and that's just not helpful for everybody. So that's not a hard set way to fix your overstriding. But that is something that we can try. I also use that when I'm seeing a lot of pelvic drop and they have cadence that's on the lower side. I might increase someone's cadence when I'm seeing a lot of crossover or weaving of their legs when they're going linearly, and you start seeing the legs cross over each other as they go. Sometimes that can be a really helpful tool. Again, no hard set rule, just something that I use as a cue sometimes, and can be really helpful for you to be able to check in on your own without me needing to watch and see what it looks like when you're running. So what are some other things? Pain and history of certain injuries cue me in to some cadence changes. Sometimes if we're on the lower end, we might increase it by 5% or so. Sometimes that's just enough. That tends to be really helpful when I'm working with people with IT band pain. That tends to be a really helpful cue. A few others, but one of the bigger ones is a history of bone stress injury. I kind of get a little bit more cautious with where their cadence is. About a couple years ago, there was a a study put out there that found a correlation between lower step rate and bone stress injury risk. Of course, we have to make sure we don't look at that in a vacuum. There's a ton of other factors, and it's just one risk out of many, and it's probably not even the most important risk factor. But when I am modifying somebody's gait that I know has a history of bone stress injury, it might be something that I consider. So this particular study, again, take it with a grain of salt, said that for every extra step per minute that the runners in their sample size they had a 5% lower risk of bone stress injury. So that's huge. So I know people with bone stress injuries are at a greater risk of bone stress injuries. So if I can reduce their risk of bone stress injury by 5%, I'm going to do it, right? Because they have some other factors working in there. So again, there's no magic number. If you're going to take anything away from this, I'm not telling you to have 180 steps per minute. I'm just telling you we need to be in that range, and it can be a helpful tool. And there's more than one way to skin a cat, right? So if you're trying to correct some sort of inefficiency in your gait and cadence is just not sticking with you and really is just hard for you to grasp, or it's not fixing what you're trying to fix, there's other ways we can do it. So just wanted to cover that topic, 'cause it's a really handy tool. And if there's no questions, then I will hop off and talk to you guys again in a couple weeks. So reach out if you have any questions about this, and I'll be happy to chat. All right, have a good night.